All right. Thank you for your practice. That's awesome. So for the past couple weeks, I've been doing a series of talks on what are known as the 3 characteristics of existence. The first week, I talked about anicca, or impermanence, the way that existence and everything within it has this impermanent quality to it. Everything arises only to pass away. No stability in anything, really, which kind of makes things a little unsatisfactory most of the time, I think. Last week, I talked about anatta, which is the Buddhist concept of non-self. The fact that we are this constantly evolving set of processes, and there's really no stability in us either. We identify with things like our name or our job, our likes and our dislikes, but at the end of the day, we're none of those things, right? So what are we? I'll let you think on that one. And so that leads us to this week. I'm going to be talking about the 3rd characteristic of existence, which is dukkha. Dukkha is often translated as stress or unsatisfactoriness, kind of disjointedness. The word dukkha is a Pali term, and it comes from, it's classically described as an untrue wheel of an ox cart. So when the wheel is going down the road, there's this kind of a rough ride to it because it's not quite true. And it's also translated as suffering, most often translated as suffering. And it's said that the Buddha only taught 2 things: suffering and the path to the end of suffering. Has anybody here experienced suffering in their lives? Yeah. I think so, right? And the Buddha was keenly aware of that. When he first awakened, the first person he ran into, his name was Upeka, and he related his experience of this awakening. He's like, oh, he said, when he came upon this person, the guy was like, oh man, you're glowing. Like, what's up with you? And he's like, I have awakened. I am the Tathagata. And he goes on and on about his awakening and how great it is. And the guy's just like, all right, man, whatever. He just kind of wanders out, shakes his head, and kind of walks away. Because people can't really relate to awakening at first. But they can relate to suffering. And so that's kind of where the Buddha started with his teachings. And so tonight I want to talk a little bit about how I came into this path, what the Buddha said about the experience of dukkha, and some practical ways to work with it within our lives. So Bhikkhu Bodhi is a very renowned Buddhist scholar and author. And in his book, The Noble Eightfold Path, it says that the search for a spiritual path is not born out of lights and ecstasy, but it's born out of the hard tax of pain, disappointment, and suffering. And that's exactly what led me to this path, was a lot of disappointment and a lot of suffering. I knew suffering from a really early age. Did not have a really good caregiving system in line when I was growing up. When I was 13, I was diagnosed with acute myelogenous leukemia, and I was faced with my own mortality before I was even finished going through puberty. Needless to say, that was a little disorienting for a 13-year-old boy who just wanted to play guitar. It was not a good time for me, and I didn't really know how to deal with it, but they knew how to deal with it. They knew how to make me comfortable, and that was with a lot of IV opiates at the age of 13. So before I had ever had a drink, before I had ever smoked a joint, I was getting IV morphine and IV Demerol. And this went on for 7-8 months until it didn't. Needless to say, I am here. I lived. But it kind of set me up for a bit of failure. It led to a lot of addiction problems later in life. I started drinking a lot because I didn't really know how to handle my emotions at that point. I didn't have proper coping mechanisms installed at that point. Started drinking a lot, drank a lot through my 20s. Was married, got divorced, was with my first wife for 10 years. And then after we separated, I met a girl, and she had a daughter, and she was 4 years old at the time. The daughter, not the girl. And we kind of hit it off and started seeing each other, and we ended up getting married, and we were together for 4 years. And when we separated, it was a really hard loss for me, losing the little girl, because the cancer, the treatment I had gotten from the cancer, effectively made me sterile. I can't have children of my own. So that was like I felt like that was like my one chance, right? And I lost it, and I fell into a really deep depression, and started using IV opiates, and it immediately felt like home, because of my prior experience. It immediately was like, oh, there's the relief that I've been looking for the past, at that point, 17 years or so. There it was again, finally. I found it. Hooray.
Like a warm blanket.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like the warmest blanket. And that was my coping mechanism for several years, was just drugs. Because I lacked any real coping mechanisms, because nobody taught me any real coping mechanisms. Needless to say, drugs were not kind to me. I lost everything I owned numerous times. And in 2014, I got arrested for conspiracy to traffic heroin over 28 grams, but less than 30 kilograms. I wasn't guilty of this charge. I was just a junkie. But I knew somebody that was apparently trafficking heroin from Texas. And because I knew him, I was guilty by association. So I found myself in jail with no bond, looking at a 25-year minimum mandatory sentence. Needless to say, this was a stressful time in my life. And I didn't know how to cope with the stress. I was suffering from a lot of anxiety, looking at 25 years minimum mandatory for some shit I legitimately wasn't guilty of. What I was guilty of was using drugs in the first place, and they do have laws against that, so I kind of put myself in the position to be where I was at. Not that I was guilty of the crime that I was charged with, but I was guilty of a crime. So while I was there, I found a book on a shelf one day, and it was called We're All Doing Time. It was by a man named Bo Lozoff, and he was friends with Stephen Levine and Ram Dass, and kind of in that early 70s spiritual wave, all the people that went over to India and found a guru and took a lot of acid and came back and wrote books. It was kind of in that clique. But it had some basic yoga asanas and some mindfulness of breathing techniques like we did earlier. And in the book it said, treat this time while you're incarcerated like your ashram. Treat this like your monastery. And so that's what I did. While everybody else was playing cards and fighting and doing jail stuff, I meditated. And honestly, it's probably the only thing that got me through that year. Because I had been to jail previously. I would get arrested and then I would immediately bond out and go home and take probation and go about my life. So I'd never actually done any real jail time. So I go from doing, just maybe a night here, or, a day or two here and there, to a year, like that, and that was pretty overwhelming.
So you got a year, I thought it was 25.
I was looking at 25. I took a plea bargain.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't have to take it to trial. Okay. That was what my $10,000 attorney suggested, was just take the plea bargain. Because if we take it to trial and we lose, you will get 25. So it seemed like a pretty safe bet to just go ahead and take the year, right? And so that's what I did. And I sat in jail for a year and I learned how to meditate. Now, the rest of the path, the rest of the Dharma and the Buddhist path, it kind of eluded me for a while, at least a couple of years. And then I slowly started getting more and more into the practice. I was still using heroin at the time, which didn't make much sense in retrospect, but it was a pretty hard thing to kick. But eventually, it is this path that helped me get clean of heroin and stay clean of all substances. So something to be said for the efficacy of this practice. And so that's my story. Like I said, I'm no stranger to suffering, and I think that's why that's where the Buddha started. Because remember I asked earlier if you could relate to the person you talk to. Yeah, it's because we all suffer the same way. We all have different things that we enjoy. We all have different likes and dislikes. We all have different hobbies, but we all suffer the same way. And so in the Buddha's first discourse after his awakening, it's called the setting of the wheel of Dharma into motion. And this is basically where he gives his discourse on the Four Noble Truths. If you're not familiar with the Four Noble Truths, they are life. The first noble truth is that life contains suffering. In life, there are experiences that are just going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. And if you're born into a human birth, you're going to have some difficulties. The second noble truth is that the cause of that suffering is craving, clinging, and attachment. The third noble truth is that our suffering ceases when we learn to let go. And the fourth noble truth is there is a path to the end of suffering, and that is the Buddhist Eightfold Path. So, as I said, the second noble truth is the cause of suffering. In Pali, it's tana. Tana means thirst or craving. It's like this unquenchable thirst, just this hole that can't be filled. We're trying to constantly fill this void that we think exists within ourselves. And we crave lots of different things. We crave material objects, the new iPhone, the new car. We crave sensory experiences, the next bowl of ice cream or sex or whatever it is. And another thing we can crave is identity. It's this quality of bhavatana. So it's this desire to be something that we're not, seeking praise or the next promotion, the big job, seeking to be someone that we're not. And Tana is this constantly recurring experience of what we want and don't want. It's the push and pull. It's the constant back and forth of craving and aversion, right? We want what we want, and we don't want what we don't want. Right? The Buddha, in this discourse, he named certain types of dukkha. And the first type is dukkha. I know that sounds funny. Yeah, a pretty good running joke in Buddhist practice about dukkha. And dukkha is classified as he said that dukkha these are like the hard pains of life. So he said that, birth is dukkha, sickness is dukkha, aging is dukkha, not getting what we want is dukkha, getting what we don't want is dukkha, being around people that we don't necessarily like is also suffering or dukkha. And this arises in response to unpleasant physical or mental sensations. I can relate it right back to the story that I told you. So the unpleasant physical and mental sensations of being diagnosed with cancer. It's dukkha. Losing someone that I held dear to me. Also dukkha. And what it was my inability to accept what was happening in that present moment. It was my aversion to what was happening. It wasn't necessarily the thing itself, but my relationship to what was happening. My not wanting it to be that way. In this practice, we talk about what are known as the 8 worldly winds. These are loss and gain, pleasure and pain, fame and shame. These are things that everyone experiences. The suffering starts when we start to take it personally. Like it's happening to just us. Like, how can this be happening to me? It's like, why wouldn't it be happening to me? Of course it's happening to me. It's happening to everybody all the time. Have you ever felt like something was happening to just you? Like the world, like the universe itself was plotting against you and you're like, no! Yeah, I think that's just normal human experience. We're all subject to sickness. We're all subject to aging. We're all going to lose people we hold dear. We're all going to have experiences that we don't want. It's when we're averse to these experiences, when we push away from these experiences, that's when we create this quality of dukkha, these hard attacks of pain from not wanting things to be the way they are. The second form of dukkha is viparinama dukkha. And this is dukkha resistant to change. So whereas dukkha arises from aversion, viparinama dukkha arises in response to pleasant experiences. So when we have something that we do enjoy, we don't want to lose it, right? We want to hold on to it as long as we can. A lot of addiction stems from this kind of suffering, because we can go to extremes in order to prolong that good feeling. We chase it real hard. But that's just natural human tendency. We naturally cling to pleasure and we naturally push away from pain. Addicts just cling a little harder to pleasure and push away from pain a little more. So, I was talking about Sunday earlier. That feeling you get on Sunday where it's like almost hard to enjoy your day because you're like, I know Monday's coming. It's right around the corner. Like you can go do it should be like the most fun shit in the world. And it's like, it would be so much better if I had one more day. That's viparinama dukkha. So it can show up even when we're having pleasant sensations. It's like, this resistance to change.
Fear of loss.
Yeah. But as we examine, viparinama dukkha, and we look at these three characteristics of existence, we know that everything is impermanent. Everything arises just to pass away. Of course it's Monday tomorrow. Why wouldn't it be Monday tomorrow? The weekend can't last forever. But neither can the week, so the weekend's coming again soon. The third form of dukkha that the Buddha talked about was sankhara dukkha. And sankharas are what are known as mental formations. So these are the thoughts that we create around situations. This is where we do a lot of our story making. And this takes us past aversion to, pleasant or unpleasant physical or mental experiences. And we start creating these narratives around things, the way things should be or shouldn't be. Is when our expectations kind of get in the way. I have a good friend of mine that does that every holiday. It's like clockwork. Like they have this expectation of the way that things should go. This magical, perfect holiday that they've built in their head, or the magical, perfect vacation that they've created. Have you ever planned a trip, right? And you're having so much fun planning the trip. You're like, oh, this is going to be awesome. This is going to be a great trip. And then you get there and you're like, this kind of fucking sucks. Right?
You set yourself up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Our expectations kind of get in the way. And this is where we start creating judgments, anxiety-filled thoughts, and ruminations, like I said, falling into the shoulds and shouldn'ts. An example of this, you can go right back to the story I told. The cancer thing. It's not fair. It's not fair that I got cancer. Well, somebody had to get cancer, right? Some kid was going to get childhood leukemia. Why wouldn't it be me? I am not beyond sickness. I'm not beyond aging. I'm not beyond death. It had to happen to somebody. And it's not personal. And it's not our fault. It's just natural human experience. Or breakups. Breakups are a good example too. I'll be alone forever. Anybody ever told yourself that one? After a breakup, like, oh, this is it. I'm never going to be in another relationship again. I'm hopelessly broken. Nobody will ever want me, right? So we create this added layer of suffering with our own mental formations. It's what we call in this practice taking the second arrow. So imagine a man walking through the woods and gets shot by an arrow. Pretty shitty situation, right? Well, then why does this always happen to me? Why am I always the one that gets shot with the arrow? So then he takes the second arrow with his own mental formations. We create so much unneeded suffering through the stories we create around circumstances that are most of the time beyond our control. So how do we deal with these forms of dukkha? How do we deal with dukkha dukkha and with viparinama dukkha and with sankhara dukkha? Well, in the Buddha's first discourse that he gave, the setting of the wheel of Dharma into motion, it's also called this very long Pali word, which is very difficult to spell. It's the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Past his description of these forms of suffering, he tells us that dukkha should be fully known and embraced. So with dukkha dukkha, the best tactic is to be with the pain, to not push away from it. Literally just sit with it. This practice of mindfulness kind of teaches us to do that. It teaches us to be aware of our pain. And it gives us insight into these three characteristics that I talked about: the impermanent, imperfect, impersonal nature of all things. These are just things that happen to us. They're not our fault. And they will pass. This too will pass. All the good times, all the bad times, they're all impermanent. So we don't cling to the good times. We don't push away from the bad times. We learn to be with our own pain. And that's an act of compassion, is to just be able to sit with those difficult emotions and know that it's okay. It's perfectly okay to be sad. It's perfectly okay to be anxious or to be depressed. We have this idea, especially in Western culture, that if you're not happy, that you're doing something wrong. Somehow you're not getting life right because you're not happy. But we only see the highlight reel of everyone's lives, and social media has made that so much worse. Everybody has this Instagram way they present themselves, and you only see the good shit, but everybody's suffering. They don't advertise that part. So that's dukkha dukkha. For viparinama dukkha, this resistance to change, I use what's called a tracking exercise or a tracing exercise. And again, mindfulness is at the key of this. So we use mindfulness to become aware of when we're suffering. And we use this tracing exercise to kind of investigate our experience, to see what is causing the suffering. So we kind of track backwards to see what's causing the suffering. With the Sunday thing, we know that we're feeling this suffering because Sunday's going to end, right? We can investigate our experience when we're having a shitty time on Sunday and be like, why do I feel this way? Oh, okay. That's why I feel this way. And once we know why it's occurring, I think that gives us a little bit more capacity to deal with it. And again, back to the three characteristics of anicca, impermanence. Once you know that, and I mean know through your own experience, through your own direct experience, that everything has this impermanent quality to it, it makes that resistance to change a little easier to bear, because we know that everything is constantly changing. And then you can actually enjoy your Sunday rather than just being in a shitty mood. For sankhara dukkha, again, mindfulness and this tracing exercise, we can observe these mental formations, and we can find the root of our discontent is often rooted in our expectations of things and the way we think things should be. In the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha tells us that when we're mindful of what we're not getting, when we're not getting what we want, and when we're getting what we don't want, then we can make a conscious decision to let go of craving and aversion. So this is that third noble truth, this letting go. letting go of all the craving, letting go of all the aversion, actually enjoying our experience as it's happening. And so when we use mindfulness in this investigation technique of tracing, even if it's only for a few minutes, we can get a little bit of peace, right? We can kind of calm our mind and get a little bit of peace. And that mindfulness of breathing exercise that we did earlier is an excellent way to do that. As I said, it's a way to break the addiction to the thinking mind. And Sankhara Dukkha is rooted in the thinking mind. And we can let go of the expectations. We can let go of judgments, the way things should or shouldn't be. And we can find a place of freedom in just being with things as they are, even when they're difficult. And so that's dukkha. That's what led me to this path, and I wouldn't be here talking about it if it hadn't had a major impact on my life. I don't think you just start teaching Buddhist practices out of nowhere. Right? Yeah, it seemed like a great idea. I had nothing else to do on Monday nights. And so that's my story and what the Buddha said about these different types of dukkha, and some practical ways to kind of work with it. And we have to work with it, right? Because it's unescapable. We're never going to get away from pain, but we can get away from suffering. I hate the cliche of pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. But it's really true. Life's going to hurt, but we can choose whether we suffer over it or not. There's this John Kabat-Zinn quote that I really like. It says, "We can't control the waves, but we can learn how to surf." So I hope all of you brought your swimsuits. Again, let's just find a position that is upright and supportive.